In the smoky, soot-stained rail yards of post-Civil War America, there existed a job so notoriously dangerous, so terrifyingly lethal, that insurance companies simply refused to write policies for the men who held it. And if you walked into any saloon in a railroad town and saw a man missing 2 or 3 fingers, you didn't even have to ask what he did for a living, because you already knew he was a brakeman who had survived the deadly game of the Lincoln pin. Before the era of safety regulations and automated machinery, connecting to train cars was a manual, horrifyingly physical process that required a worker to stand directly between 2 massive, moving walls of iron, weighing tens of tons each, waiting until the very last second to guide a heavy iron link into a slot and drop a pin to secure it, before the cars crashed together with bone-crushing force. Every single time a train needed to be assembled or a car needed to be dropped off at a station, a human being had to risk his life in this gap of death. And because the trains in the 1870s and 1880s had inconsistent bumpers in varying heights, the brakeman often had to lift the heavy link with one hand while guiding the pin with the other, all while the locomotive engineer, who often couldn't even see the worker clearly through the steam and darkness, shoved the cars backward. If the worker's hand was just 1 inch too slow, or if his sleeve got caught on a jagged piece of metal, or if he slipped on the icy grease-slick tracks, the bumpers would slam together and crush his hand, his arm, or even his entire body, leaving him maimed or dead in an instant. The statistics from this era are absolutely staggering to modern ears, with thousands of men dying every single year and tens of thousands more suffering horrific, life-altering injuries, creating a literal army of amputees across the United States, who had sacrificed their bodies to build the industrial economy. It was widely accepted by the railroad barons of the time that this suffering was just the unavoidable cost of doing business. A tragic but necessary blood sacrifice to keep the commerce of the nation moving, and despite the screams of the injured and the pleas of widows, the wealthy owners refused to invest in safer technology because the link and pin system was cheap, simple, and universally compatible, even if it was soaked in the blood of their employees. The workers were terrified every time they stepped onto the tracks, knowing that their next shift could easily be their last. But they had families to feed and few other options in a rugged economy, so they kept stepping between the cars, praying that their luck wouldn't run out. But amidst this carnage, in the quiet town of Alexandria, Virginia, a man who was neither a professional engineer nor a railroad tycoon was watching the world change. And he began to wonder if there was a way to stop the slaughter using a simple idea based on the anatomy of the human hand itself. The man who would eventually solve this horrific problem was Major Eli Hamilton Janney, a Confederate veteran of the Civil War who had returned home to Virginia, not to a life of glory, but to the humble and quiet existence of a dry goods clerk. Yet his mind was constantly worried with mechanical ideas and a deep, empathetic desire to stop the senseless mutilation of the railroad men he saw in his community. Janney was not a trained engineer with a university degree, but he was a keen observer of nature and mechanics. And he spent his lunch breaks and his evenings whittling pieces of wood, obsessively trying to figure out a mechanism that could connect to cars automatically without requiring a human being to stand in the suicide zone between them. Legend has it that his eureka moment didn't come from studying gears or levers, but from looking at his own hands and hooking his forefingers together in a curved, interlocking grip, realizing that if he could replicate that natural, knuckles-locked handshake in steel, he could create a coupler that would close and lock upon impact without anyone needing to touch it. He poured his heart and soul into this invention, using his meager savings to patent his device in 1873, calling it an improvement in car couplings, but having a brilliant idea and getting the stubborn, penny-pinching railroad industry to actually adopt it were 2 completely different battles. For years, Janney faced rejection after rejection because the railroad executives looked at his strange, knuckle-shaped device and saw only an unnecessary expense, arguing that it would cost too much to retrofit their thousands of rail cars and that the old link and pin system, deadly as it was good enough for their bottom line. Janney was relentless, traveling from office to office, demonstrating his wooden models and pleading his case, often being dismissed as a dreamer or a nuisance by men who sat in comfortable offices, far away from the blood-stained tracks where their workers were dying daily. It seemed for a long time that Janney's invention would be destined for the dustbin of history. Just another clever patent that never saw the light of day. While the death toll continued to rise with every passing year, and the newspapers continued to print the obituaries of young men crushed between the cars. However, the sheer effectiveness of his design eventually caught the eye of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which decided to give it a trial run. And once the workers saw it in action, how the 2 iron hands would slap together and lock instantly, holding the cars together securely while allowing them to turn corners without braking, they knew they were looking at their salvation. Yet, even with proof that the device worked perfectly, the industry as a whole dragged its feet, refusing to standardize the Janney Coupler because they didn't want to pay the royalties or coordinate with competitor railroads, leading to a situation where a train might have some cars with safe couplers and others with the deadly old ones, making the situation confusing and still dangerous. The world needed more than just a good invention. It needed a force powerful enough to compel these giant corporations to value human life over profit. And that force was about to arrive in a way that no one expected. The tipping point finally came not from the boardroom, but from the public and the government, as the outrage over the continuous slaughter of railroad workers grew so loud that it could no longer be ignored by the politicians in Washington, D.C., leading to a massive push for federal safety legislation. Former President Benjamin Harrison, who had seen the devastation of the Civil War and had no stomach for the peacetime casualties of the railroads, championed the cause, and in 1893, the United States Congress passed the Safety Appliance Act, a landmark piece of legislation that mandated that all trains engaged in interstate commerce must be equipped with automatic couplers that could be uncoupled without the necessity of men going between the ends of the cars. It was a massive victory for the unions and the workers, forcing the railroads to finally adopt Eli Janney's brilliance, effectively banning the link and pin system that had widowed so many women and left so many children fatherless. The transition wasn't immediate, as the railroads were given a few years to upgrade their massive fleets, but as the Janney couplers replaced the old iron links, the accident rates plummeted almost overnight, dropping by over 90% in the years following the full implementation of the law. It is no exaggeration to say that Eli Janney's invention saved tens of thousands of lives in the first few decades alone, and millions more over the last century. Because if you look at a train today, anywhere in North America or even in China, you will still see a version of that same handshake coupler, virtually unchanged from the design Janney whittled out of wood in Alexandria back in the 1870s. Janney himself didn't die, an incredibly wealthy tycoon, but he lived long enough to see his invention become the standard of the world. Knowing that because of his persistence and his simple idea, fathers were coming home to their families instead of dying on the coal tracks. This story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important heroes in history are the generals or the presidents. But the ordinary people who see a problem refuse to accept the status quo and use their creativity to protect their fellow man. The next time you are stopped at a railroad crossing and you see those heavy freight cars rumbling past, take a close look at the connection between them and remember, the major who dreamed of a handshake that could hold the world together. If you enjoyed this story about the hidden history of everyday things, please hit that like button and subscribe, because it really helps us share these forgotten tales with more people. And let me know in the comments. Do you think modern companies still cut corners on safety like the railroads did, or have we learned our lesson?